Hi, this is John Ainsley, CTO at Doulos. Easier UVM, reporting. This video is going to be a tutorial on the reporting features in UVM. During this tutorial I'm going to be taking advantage of Doulos' Easier UVM, which is a set of coding guidelines and a code generator for generating UVM code. Later on in this tutorial I'll show you an example of using the Easier UVM code generator within EDA Playground so that we can generate some example code. 90% of what you need to know about reporting in UVM is actually shown on this one slide. UVM gives you 4 reporting macros: UVM info, UVM warning, UVM error, UVM fatal that you can see here. And using these 4 macros in the appropriate places in your UVM code is actually most of what you need to know. So you can see here that there's 4 different macros corresponding to 4 different severity levels: info, warning, error and fatal. Then each of the 4 macros has at least 2 arguments. The first argument is an ID, which can be used to categorize the messages. The second argument is the message text itself. And then the third argument, which is only used for reports with a severity of info, is the verbosity of the report. Typically you're going to be using the macros as shown at the bottom of the slide, so a good choice for the ID, if you can't think of anything better, is get type name. I'll show you what that's about on the next slide. Then the actual text of the message, and then a good choice for verbosity would be UVM medium, which it turns out is the default verbosity level. Let's take a look at the ID in a little bit more detail. So the message ID can be used to place messages into categories. And if you like, you can be very selective about the category that you choose for each message. If you don't want to think about it in too much detail, however, a good default choice is get type name. Get type name is a method that returns a text string representing the class name of the class that contains the method call. So get type name is a good default choice. It makes the class name containing the report visible in the message. The one time that you can't use get type name is if you're not inside a class. So if you're using one of the message macros in a module, for example, not a class, you can't call get type name. So in this example at the top, we've used a literal text string top TB instead. That's the name of the module. Let's take a look at verbosity in a bit more detail. Verbosity is the third argument to the UVM info macro. And verbosity tells you how verbose this particular message is. Messages that have a low verbosity are likely to get output. Messages with a high verbosity are likely not to be output. The default verbosity is UVM medium, and by default any UVM info message that has a verbosity of UVM medium or lower will be output, and any report with a verbosity higher than UVM medium will just get ignored. There's actually 6 predefined enumeration values for verbosity ranging from UVM none up to UVM debug. And there's a default threshold. The default threshold is actually UVM medium, and that means that any message with verbosity UVM medium or lower will be output. Any message with a verbosity of UVM high or higher will be ignored. You can move the verbosity threshold up or down. If you move the verbosity threshold up on this diagram toward the UVM none end, that will mean that there'll be less output. If you move the verbosity threshold toward the UVM debug end, that'll mean there's more output, fewer reports get ignored. The choice of verbosity level is actually quite important if things are not to get out of hand. So the Easier UVM coding guidelines make some recommendations as to what is a good verbosity level to choose. The default UVM medium is a good default for info messages, and it's also a good level to choose for any messages that are related to the behaviour of the design under test. So here we've got an info message saying that the DUT returned a checksum. UVM medium would be a good choice for messages related to debugging the DUT. Messages with a lower verbosity level are more likely to be output, of course. So messages of a lower level, such as UVM low, should only be used for really important messages that you always want output. So for example, start of test stimulus, which is telling us that we're actually going on to generate some stimulus for our test. That might be an example of a message that you always want output, so we've chosen UVM low as the verbosity. Higher verbosity level messages are less likely to be output, more likely to be filtered. So UVM high is a good choice for messages related to debugging the test bench or the UVM environment, as opposed to messages debugging the DUT. So messages related to debugging the UVM code itself, you might select UVM high, and that means those messages are less likely to be output. But don't just choose the verbosity level at random, otherwise you'll find things will get very much out of control when you come to running your simulations. It's always worth being disciplined about choosing the verbosity level. We set the verbosity threshold, that's the threshold at which info messages are actually written out, by making a call to one of the two methods set report verbosity level or set report verbosity level hierarchical, and we'll see there are other variations on these methods as well. All of these reporting methods are methods of the class UVM component. Well, strictly speaking, they're methods of the class UVM report object, which is a base class of UVM component. So when you call a method like set report verbosity level, it actually applies to a particular component. If you just call set report verbosity level, that would apply to the current component, but you can explicitly call the methods of other components. So mAgent.setReport verbosity level UVM high is setting the verbosity level for the agent component and just the agent component. There's a variation on this method that can be used to set the verbosity level for a component and all of its children. That's set report verbosity level hierarchical. When you'll find a lot of the set report methods have a variation with an underscore HIER suffix that applies hierarchically to a component and all of its children. If you wanted to set the verbosity threshold globally, you can do that by calling UVM top set report verbosity level hierarchical. So UVM top is a built-in variable of type UVM root, and that variable refers to a notional top level component sitting at the very top of the UVM component hierarchy. As I said, it's of a special class UVM root, and we can use that combined with set report verbosity level hierarchical to set the verbosity level of every single component throughout the entire UVM component hierarchy. Now let's look at what happens when we actually execute the UVM info macro or one of the other macros. By default, we'll get a report printed out, dependent on the verbosity level and the verbosity threshold, of course. And all of the information associated with that report will be written out to the simulation log by default. So let's take a look at all of the fields that are going to be written out. We start out with the severity level, which depends on which of the four macros we used. Then comes the file name and the line number of the report. Macros actually have access to whereabouts they're called in the source code, so the UVM info, warning macros and so on will print out the file name and the line number of the report. Then comes the simulation time at 105. And then the instance name of the component instance from which the report is being generated, UVM test top.menv in this case. Then in square brackets comes the ID or category of the report. In this particular report we chose get type name as its ID, so get type name returns the class name. We're printing out mynv as the category of the report. That allows us to see in a very simple way which class this report was generated from. Then finally comes the actual text of the report, the second argument to UVM info. And it's very handy to be able to use the system call $s_format_f in order to generate the text of the report. $s_format_f allows us to write out not just text strings, but also the values of variables embedded within those text strings. So it's very handy to use $s_format_f along with one of the 4 reporting macros. So if you've made use of the 4 reporting macros and chosen appropriate message IDs and appropriate verbosity levels, then when you run your simulations, you'll get a whole set of reports which by default will be printed out as part of the simulator log. And what you can now do is inspect those reports in the simulator log and decide, just based on the contents of the report, what to do next. In particular, you can choose to filter out reports based on their verbosity, or you can set actions associated with those reports, and those actions can be set based on the instance of the component that writes out the report, or also based on the severity level or the ID of the report. And you can find all of that information from the report string itself. You can customize the reporting in UVM purely based on the text that you see within the report itself. You don't need any access to the original UVM code that generated the reports in order to customize the behavior of the report handler in UVM, and that's a really nice feature. So we've already looked at how to set the verbosity threshold in order to filter out reports of high verbosity. Let's now look at how we can associate actions with reports. UVM gives you 3 methods, each of which is a method of the UVM report object class, a base class of UVM component, for associating actions with reports based on their severity or their ID. So let's start at the top and work down. Set report severity action lets you set an action based on the severity of the report. So in this case, we're saying that we want all UVM info reports written to a log file. So that's going to apply to any info reports generated from the current component. All info reports from the current component will be written to a log file. Then we're calling set report ID action, and that lets you associate actions with all reports from a particular component that have a particular ID or fall into a particular category. So all reports from the current component where the ID is myenv are being set the action of UVM log combined with UVM exit. So it turns out that in UVM, all the enumerations that represent actions are actually bit masks. So you can combine actions by ORing together the bit masks associated with those actions. UVM log is a particular bit mask, UVM exit is a particular bit mask. We OR those together, and that has the effect of combining the actions. So we've set an action based on a severity, we've set an action based on an ID. We can also set an action based on both severity and ID. So here we're saying set report severity ID action, UVM info, myenv, UVM display. In other words, info messages whose ID is myenv have the action UVM display. So you can see here 3 different methods: severity action, ID action, and severity ID action. And those methods take the priority shown on the slide in increasing order from top to bottom of the slide. So set report severity action has the lowest priority. If we also set a report ID action that applies to the very same report, then the ID action will take priority over the severity action. And if we do set report severity ID action, that has the highest priority of all. So remembering that all of these set report methods are methods of a UVM component, we could, if we wished, choose to set a report action for some other component. So here we're calling UVM top.setReportID_action hierarchical in order to set an ID action for all components throughout the entire component hierarchy, starting with the top level component UVM top and then applying that action to the top level component and all of its children. There are a whole bunch of defaults. In fact, there are default actions depending on the severity of the report. So for UVM info and UVM warning reports, the default action is UVM display, which just has the effect of writing out the report to the simulation log. For UVM error, the default action is UVM display combined with UVM count. What UVM count does is to stop simulation after a maximum quit count has been reached. So after we've seen a certain number of errors, no further errors would be displayed, but the simulation would simply stop. Then for UVM fatal reports, the default action is UVM display combined with UVM exit, which aborts simulation. Let's take a look at all of the available actions that are built into UVM. So there's 7 built-in predefined actions listed here. UVM no action does nothing, but UVM no action is actually an active action which not only does nothing, but it suppresses all of the other actions. Then UVM display, the default for most of the severity levels, which just causes the report to be printed out to standard output. UVM log will redirect the report to an explicitly opened log file, although to make that work you do actually have to open a log file, as I'll explain in a minute. UVM count will count the number of reports and on reaching a maximum quit count abort simulation. You can set the maximum quit count by calling the set max quit count method. UVM exit then immediately aborts the simulation. That's the default action where the severity level is fatal. UVM stop does a soft breakpoint, it calls $stop. And UVM RM recorder sends the report to the UVM recorder. There's one very important gotcha associated with the reporter in UVM that's such a painful gotcha I'm going to explain it explicitly. Let's take a look at this code. Here we have the code for the build phase method of a UVM environment. So within the build phase method, we're using the UVM info macro to write out a report to say that we've entered the build phase. We're then grabbing some information from the configuration database, and before we start instantiating child components, we're setting a report severity action hierarchically on this component and all of its children to suppress all warning methods. So we're setting an action based on the severity of the report and saying whenever we generate a report from this component with a severity of UVM warning, then we want to suppress that action so we don't see that report at all. And that will have the desired effect in the sense that it will set an action for the current component. However, what we're doing here is calling set report severity action hierarchical. We mean this action to apply to this current component and to all of its children. But it's not going to do what we might hope it to do because we haven't created any children yet. Set report severity action hierarchical is a method of a component, and for that method to work, the components in question have to exist. But we haven't created the children yet. The children only get created later on when we make these calls to create, and then recursively inside the calls to create we make calls to the constructors of those components and eventually ask the factory to create the components for us. At this point we haven't created the components, and so we won't be setting report actions for those components. So it's critical when you call methods of the report handler to only call the methods of the report handler after the components in question have been instantiated. So the best fix here would be to move the call to set report severity action hierarchy to some later UVM phase, such as the end of elaboration or the start of simulation phase, for example. Very important point to bear in mind. Let's talk a little about log files. I mentioned the predefined action UVM log. If you use the action UVM log, you also have to actually open a log file and make a call to set report in order to associate that file with the appropriate components in UVM. If you use UVM log without setting a log file, then the log report will simply get lost. So in order to create a log file, we need to open a log file in System Verilog in the usual way, assign a file handle, and we can then make a call to one of the methods of class UVM report object in order to set a log file. So set report default file hierarchical will do the trick. That will set the default file for all IDs and all severity levels for this current component and all of its children. There's a whole family of set report methods in UVM. I'm not showing you all of the methods in this tutorial. If you want to see a complete list of methods, then you should look up the UVM class reference or the UVM standard. So there's lots of methods with the prefix set report that can be used for setting verbosity, setting actions, setting files, doing severity overrides, and so on. So I've walked you through the main features of the UVM report handler. I'd encourage you now to go off and play with these features yourself by taking advantage of the easier UVM code generator, which you can run on EDA Playground. So if you go to the URL shown at the top of the slide here, you'll be able to run this example for yourself. Here you can see the main screen of EDA Playground, where on the left we've got various tabs that contain easier UVM control files and code fragments. On the right we've got the design under test, and at the bottom of the window you can see the reports coming out from the UVM reporter as simulation is being run. So the reports that you can see here are actually coming from a UVM info call that's positioned inside the design under test. Now, using UVM report macros within the design under test isn't particularly usual practice, but it will work provided we've remembered to write the necessary include directive within the design under test. So here within the design under test we're generating an info message. Because we're not in a class, we've set the message ID to blank, and then we've got the text of the message, and we can see the message being written out in the simulator log. What you'll then see on EDA Playground is various examples of setting actions and setting verbosity levels in order to control what's printed out. And I'll actually be showing you two different techniques for controlling the verbosity level and for setting actions. We'll be doing that by making the method calls that we've seen earlier on in the tutorial, and we'll be doing it from the UVM command line. So all of the methods that we've seen for setting verbosity level and setting actions can also be controlled from the UVM command line using the UVM command line processor. And that's a very neat alternative because it allows you to set the verbosity level or to control actions without having to recompile your UVM code. So in each of the examples that follow, and each of the examples that you can run for yourself within EDA Playground, I'm going to be showing you two alternatives, one alternative using a command line setting and a second alternative using a call to one of the set report methods. So we've got a call to UVM info in the design under test that I've already highlighted. There's also calls to UVM info within the code fragments that define the UVM driver and the UVM monitor. So in each case we've got a use of the UVM info macro, the message ID is getTypeName, and we've set the verbosity to UVM high, so those methods are not printed out by default. Then the common.tpl file, that's the control file that's common to all of the agents within our easier UVM code generator. That contains a set of alternative command lines that we can enable. So we've got a number of UVM command line settings here in the easier UVM code generator that's adding particular flags to the UVM command line. I'll highlight what those flags actually are as we talk through the example. Then we've got a setting test inc inside in the easier UVM code generator that's inserting this code fragment into our test. The code fragment is a start of simulation phase method, and within this start of simulation phase there's various set report method calls that we can enable in order to customize the report handler. So let's talk through those one by one. The first setting we're going to make will turn up the verbosity level for all components to UVM high. So that you can do that with a method called UVM top.set report verbosity level hierarchical UVM high to set all of the verbosity for all components to UVM high. You can do the same thing from the UVM command line by adding the flag plus UVM verbosity equals UVM high, which would have exactly the same effect without any need to actually modify the System Verilog source code. So you don't do both of these things, it's either or. You could do both, but that would have the same effect as doing either of them separately. So that turns up the verbosity level globally. You could also turn up the verbosity level for individual components or for individual severities or individual IDs. So here we're turning up the verbosity level for all messages where the ID indicates that the message has come from the driver class. So to do that with a method call inside the System Verilog code, we might say UVM top.setReport ID verbosity hierarchical clock and data driver UVM high. That's setting the verbosity to UVM high for all messages that have the message ID clock and data driver. That is, all the messages that were actually generated from the driver class. We could do the same thing on the UVM command line by including the command line flag UVM set verbosity, setting the component path name to UVM test top.star. Notice that the command line flag allows you to include wildcards within the path name. Then we've set the ID to clock and data driver and the verbosity to UVM high and said that we want that to apply within the run phase. So if you're driving this from the command line, the UVM command line processor allows you to specify the particular UVM phase in which we want this verbosity setting to apply. Now we'll turn up the verbosity level specifically for the monitor component by calling the method setReportVerbosityLevel of a particular component instance. So we've got mn.mClockandDataAgent.mMonitor.setReportVerbosityLevel UVM high. We could do the same thing from the command line by actually typing out the specific path name UVM test top.mn.mClockandDataAgent.mMonitor. Notice at the bottom we're actually within the System Verilog code, so we have to write a well-formed System Verilog variable name. This is an actual variable name buried inside the System Verilog code. If we set the path name from the command line, we're not actually typing in a variable name, we're typing in effectively a string name that's constructed by concatenating together the individual strings that were passed into our create methods, starting with the string name UVM test top. So the name at the top will only match the name at the bottom, provided the string names of our component instance match the variable names of the equivalent component instance. Then in order to make this set verbosity call apply to messages of all IDs, we've included this special string underscore all underscore as an argument to plus UVM set verbosity on the command line. So in this case, the underscore all underscore means all IDs for this particular component. Now let's look at doing a severity override. A severity override means replacing one severity with another severity. So looking at the System Verilog source code at the bottom, here we're doing a set report severity override to say, in effect, convert reports with a severity of UVM info to the severity level UVM warning. We're converting info reports into warning reports. It turns out that set report severity override doesn't have a hierarchical version in the current release of the UVM standard. So if you want to do set report severity override on multiple components, you have to call this method one by one for each of the components. So we're doing set report severity override on the top level component and also on the sequencer, driver, monitor and coverage collection components. If you do the same thing from the UVM command line using the command line processor, you can take a shortcut, however, and you can set the component path name to star, which is a wildcard. So here we're first of all setting the verbosity level to high, globally. That means that all UVM info reports are going to get printed out regardless of their verbosity, and then we're converting the severity of all of those info messages from info to warning. So if we look at the command line version, the first argument is the component instance name, which can include wildcards. The second argument is the ID of the report, and _all _ is being used to apply this setting to all IDs. Then comes the old severity level and then the new severity level that we're replacing it with. So moving on to the next example. Here we're making a set report action call in order to turn off all info messages globally. So first of all, let's look at the compiled version. The method UVM top.setReportSeverityAction hierarchical is globally suppressing all info messages by setting an action UVM no action and applying it globally to all messages of severity UVM info. We could do the same thing using the command line processor by setting the component instance path name to a wildcard, setting the ID field to _all_ to apply to messages of all ID. So then we're setting an action for messages with the severity UVM info and setting the action itself to UVM no action. We could redirect all messages from the monitor to a log file. Let's start off by looking at the compiled version. So we're making a call to set report severity action in order to set the action to UVM log. If we want to report all messages to the log file regardless of their severity, then with the functional version we actually need to make 4 separate calls to set report severity action, one for each of the 4 severities: info, warning, error or fatal. If we're doing that from the UVM command line, we can just set the corresponding argument, the severity argument, to _all _, again illustrating that there's some very useful shortcuts if we're doing these settings from the command line. So talking through the procedural code, we're opening a file, making a set report call in order to set that file. Even if you're applying the setting from the UVM command line, you still need to open the file itself and make the call to set report default file hierarchical from inside the system Verilog code. You can't actually open the file from the command line. The set report verbosity level, however, you can do from the command line with the plus verbosity flag, and then we're setting the report severity action. So I've given you a tutorial explaining all of the basics of the report handler in UVM, and also given you a bunch of examples that you can run over the internet, taking advantage of the Easier UVM code generator and EDA Playground. At Doulos we deliver training classes, so if you'd like to know any more about the training classes that Doulos offer on System Verilog or on UVM, then do check out our website, doulos.com.